Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to another Sweet Thursday program. Today with Naomi Krupitsky. Thank you for joining us on Zoom webinar. Our next program is in just 2 weeks, also by Zoom. On the Zoom webinar format, we can't see or hear you, unlike Zoom meeting. Today, we have added closed captioning for the first time, so you can enable that on your Zoom screen down toward the bottom right. Sweet Thursday is the author series sponsored by the Friends of the Lafayette Library, which is an organization run by volunteers that sells gently used books in order to support the library. My name is Jeff Deaton, and I'm the coordinator of the program. Today's moderator is Ruth Thornburg. We have several webinars scheduled for the next few months. We hope to resume in-person programs in the fall. On April 7th, Dave Zirin will discuss the world of sports activism as described in his book, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. And then on May 12th, Marion Nessel will share secrets of food research and marketing and her book, Unsavory Truth, How Food Companies Skew the Science of What We Eat. Our next WOW, or Wonder of the World program, will be on April 13th, when a docent from the DeYoung Museum via Zoom will discuss their exhibition, Alice Peel, People Come First. And then just booked is on June 8th, also a docent from the same DeYoung Museum will be talking about the Obama Portraits Tour featuring art from the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. Neither of these will be able to be recorded. If you miss a webinar or want to watch any of the ones that are recorded, you can check them out on our friend's YouTube channel. And in order to learn about all of our programming, you can sign up for a weekly email, which will describe a number of events, not just those of the Friends, but also the county and the Library Foundation. And you can do that on llcf.org/subscribe. Throw in your name and email, and you'll get a weekly email every Saturday. For more programs, those including all the Contra Costa Library branches, you would go to the ccclib.org, and you can browse around by different tabs and find by type or date a number of other programs. The Friends Corner Bookshop sells inexpensive, gently used books that support a number of programs listed here and services at the Lafayette Library. The Friends Amazon store, which we sell slightly higher value books, can be accessed via the Friends tab on the library website. And once again, we offer our thanks to those who support us, including the Friends of the Lafayette Library, the library staff, and the Library Foundation, and especially my Sweet Thursday committee. And your tonight's book, tonight's author's book can be purchased at Orinda Books. And you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Tonight, Ruth Thornburg will lead a discussion with our author. And Ruth has, as we know, she's actually moderated a number of events this year and served on the board of the Friends for many years and is part of our committee and a regular moderator. So Ruthie, you're on. So once you fire up your audio and video, I will turn off my screen share. And there we go.
Hello, welcome everyone. So good to have you with us tonight. As Jeff said, we're going to have Naomi Krupitsky with us tonight, and I'm really excited about sharing this book with you. Naomi, the author of The Family, this is her debut novel, and it almost immediately became a New York Times bestseller, which is quite an event for a brand new author. So I think a lot to celebrate there for her. It was also selected by the Today Show. It was Reads with Jenna item, and so she got to participate in that, which I think must have been a lot of fun. So pretty neat exposure for this young author that we're going to be meeting tonight. Naomi grew up in Berkeley, so we can sort of claim her as a East Bay resident. And she attended the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at NYU. And she lived in New York for quite a while. She's lived many other places, but currently is in San Francisco. Anyway, she's also, besides writing this novel, she works as a bookseller, and she's done some editing work. So with that, I'd love to bring you on. Naomi, please join us. There she is.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me, Ruth. Thank you for that generous introduction.
Oh, absolutely. We're pretty happy that you're here with us tonight. And I'm just going to jump right in. I think for me, the first thing I'd really like to talk about is the book is called The Family. And without even needing to go into a lot of detail, there's an inference there that this is not just your natural family, but a type of family. And I found it really fun that the family was really this mafia kind of connection. And I was fascinated with how you decided to make that such a part of the book. And I'd like for you to just sort of give us some background about, why you felt like that would be an interesting angle. And, did you have some prior experience? Were there just things that made you curious about it and you wanted to learn more, or what? Just share with us.
Yeah, it was very multifaceted, which I think a lot of this process was. As I started focusing in certain areas, it turned out that I sort of had the interests and the ingredients there already to sort of sustain an interest in it over the next several years that I was writing the book. In this specific case, I started off writing with this image of Sophia and Antonio. So those are the main characters in the book. They're best friends. They grow up side by side in adjoining apartments, so they share a wall. And I had this really clear image of them growing up together and of the way that their friendship would sort of ebb and flow and the ways that their personalities would play off of one another. And then I also almost immediately knew how I wanted the book to end. And it ends in a very sort of explosive, kind of climactic, violent way.
True.
And I had to get these two little girls to that ending. And as I started exploring settings and time and place and culture, I sort of realized that the mafia would be this great fit. And I realized that I had already studied a lot of the history that I would need to sort of talk about New York in that time and place. I had this background in mythology, studying classics, and I started to sort of think of the mafia as a legend or a myth, a story that we tell over and over again, something that as a culture, we're just interested in. Like as soon as you see that the title is The Family and you think maybe this has a little bit of a mafia bent to it, I think that draws a lot of people, and it drew me as a writer. I wanted to engage with that sort of archetype. I wanted to spend time in that world. There's something that really draws me as an artist, draws us as a culture back again and again to this kind of story. And so it was a really fun place to spend a few years.
Oh, I can imagine. And, I think for myself, I found it really interesting because not that I have a lot of direct experience, but I grew up in Kansas City, and there is the mob, is kind of known to be there. And there were always these little stories that none of us knew for sure, but there was always this little discussion or thread about certain kids that, oh yeah, they have, this connection or that. And so it was always kind of intriguing, I guess. And it wasn't that I knew them well or anything, they would just be classmates, but it was intriguing. Well, about the relationship between these two girls, I just found that also so well put together. And, they have big differences, but they're also, when they start out, they're just so connected. They're just like, they're inseparable. And you mentioned the wall that they share. I mean, even they sleep next to each other in a sense because of that wall they share. And their fathers work in the same, work together. We'll just say that. And their mothers are also close. And I just wondered, did you have a relationship or a friendship like that growing up? Was there a family that you lived near that, you
Yes and
shared?
no. I think more than one friend that I carried through most of my life. I had these sort of serial friends, friends that I would become so close with, and then sort of fade away, and that happened to me several times over the course of my childhood and teenage years. And I really, really wanted to capture, to explore, to try to spend time with the way that I think particularly friendships between young girls can be so intense, and in many ways more intense than it feels like having siblings or family feels when you're 11. Like your best friend is a part of you in some ways. And that's true even if they're your best friend for 9 months. But I really wanted Sophia and Antonia to stay together for their whole lives. I wanted to see what that friendship looked like as they sort of grew up and began to evolve into their own people. How do they come back together again and again? Which isn't necessarily something that I experienced in my own friendships. I have many friends now that I've had for a long time, but I don't have that like childhood sort of like sister like best friend experience. And I think maybe that was something that I like wanted to spend time with.
I can understand that. I mean, I grew up next door to a family of all girls, and there was one in particular, and we sort of had a similar relationship. We were very close when we were young. And then as we moved into sort of middle school, junior high, or high school, really, our differences became greater. And we both ended up moving away. So kind of lost track. But when I was reading the story, it made me resonate, it resonated with me because of that. And I felt like you described the experience of the friendship so well that that's why I asked the question, did you have that experience? I thought it was nicely done. But speaking about their kind of separation as they grew, their relationship ebbs and flows, and I felt like their differences really became more apparent as they moved into school. You talk about how when they first start school, they're sort of ostracized from the other families, the other children. So they're kind of kept just to themselves. But then as they get older, things change. And I just thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how their relationship evolved.
Yeah. So there's two things that come to mind immediately. The first is that Sophia and Antonia really have these polar opposite personalities. So Sophia is very reserved, she's quieter, she's more introspective, and Sophia is like really wild and really bold and really out there. And as young children, there's not really a context for that for them. So they don't see how the other one's behavior reflects once they're in a greater society, even if that's the society of middle school. And then once they get to middle and high school and they start to see like, oh, Antonia's like studious and she's doing well in school, and that makes Sophia feel kind of bad about her own performance. And Sophia is just this like bright burning ball of sunlight, and she attracts all this attention, and it makes Antonia feel kind of small. And because I went into this knowing that they were going to come back together, what was interesting to me about that was at every moment, how are these two girls interacting with the world around them in a way that's different from each other? So how does Sophia react to this situation versus Antonia? Where is Sophia's insecurity here versus Antonia's? And what makes Sophia feel powerful versus Antonia? And those things they're pretty much the opposite for both of them. And then how do they communicate given that reality? And that communication between them is sometimes forced. It's sometimes just because they live next to each other, but they still have to do it. And I really enjoyed writing, especially that sort of tumultuous teenage period where if they hadn't lived next to each other and their lives hadn't been tied together the way that their lives are tied together, they might have fallen away from one another. And instead they have to really find this common ground, and they really have to figure out a way to take strength from one another, and to sort of confront the things that makes each of them insecure. And I think as somebody who was once a teenage girl, the ways that other girls can make you feel either powerful or less powerful without intending to was really interesting to me, and was really like a salient sort of powerful thing to think about.
Yeah, and you come across really well explaining that. You've mentioned the word power, and I did want to talk about that because I feel like power is a big theme throughout the book. You have obviously the power of the fathers, Joey in particular, and then the power between the two girls, but the mothers also have their own version of power. And I just thought it would be interesting to let you talk a little bit about that and how you utilized their either, use of power or their need for power. It's kind of an interesting theme.
Yeah. So this book takes place from the 1920s to the 1940s, which would be historically a time when in the mafia, for example, or in greater society, women wouldn't have necessarily had all that much power. But the central characters of this book are women, and the book is about the mafia. So it was really natural for me to sort of explore power and to explore how in their time these women might have tried to get power. What does wanting to be powerful mean to them? Does it just mean being sort of independent? Does it mean being sovereign? Does it mean getting other people to do what you want? Does it mean feeling strong in your own skin? Or does it mean looking strong to a group of people? And I think that over the course of their lives, Sophia and Antonia both really reckon with what it is that they don't have, what it is that they want from their lives. And they try to figure out like the language to talk about that. And then because there's this backdrop of the mafia, it was really sort of fun and interesting to compare this sort of more subtle ways, and in some cases not so subtle, but mostly more subtle ways that Sophia and Antonia are trying to get personal and sort of cultural and familial power, versus the way that like Sophia's father, Joey, gets power in his neighborhood that he's in charge of, or the way that like a mother might have power, sort of like subtle, quiet power over the family dinner table. Those things, I'm glad you asked about that. I don't know if I have anything like so revealing to say other than I really liked writing about that. At one point, my editor was like, you have to take out some of these instances of power. Like it has to mean something every time you say it. And I was like, it does, it means something every time I say it.
Sure.
But I think it's much better now than it was in that version.
Well, we don't know that. You may say that.
Trust me.
Yeah, no, I think that power is always a key element, especially when you're talking about a family. And it doesn't have to be a mafia family. Even if it's just who does the dishes and making sure that that gets, dealt with or whatever. There can be very subtle power, and then there can be very, very unavoidable power that you just like, wow, that's just intense. So I thought you did a good job of pulling the thread through. And one of the things that I kind of, as we're talking about power, as I was reading it, there's this sort of feel, especially I think with Sophia, but also Antonia, it's like an anxiety over what they want or need, or are, what their desires are and how to accomplish that. And so I just thought I'd ask you to talk a little bit about that, this kind of thread of anxiety kind of going through and how they start recognizing that they want more or they want different, and how that got accomplished. So
Yeah, I think I just mentioned this in my last answer, but one of the things that I was most interested in was trying to figure out how to sort of within the constraints of the times that Antonia and Sophia live within, how do I sort of nudge them both toward finding the language to talk about who they are and what they want. I think especially in historical fiction, there can be this tendency to reduce people down to a stereotype of their time. So people just didn't want that back then. And I don't think that's true. And so I really wanted Sophia and Antonia to come across as whole people, but they also live when they live. And so there are some things they wouldn't have language for. And whereas I grew up in a different time, I'm sure there's things that I don't have language for, and that causes me some kind of underlying anxiety. And I really like the phrasing of it as anxiety, because I think knowing that you want something different from what you've been offered, but not being able to figure out how to articulate what it is that you want, is a source of anxiety. That's exactly what it does. And so Sophia and Antonia both have to sort of reckon with like who they are and what they want within the constraints and confines of the culture and the time that they were raised into, that they were born into.
Yeah. And the other thing that made me think about, because I'm more the mother age, you're more the daughter age, but you look at their mothers, and I want to talk about both of them because I think they're very interesting characters, but you look at the mothers and what their confines were. Okay, they had, certain parameters that they lived within, mainly based on the era and as you said, the culture. But then the daughters now have made this additional step. They've stepped out further. And so their parameters are different. And it makes me wonder, like their children, what will those parameters be like? And I just think that's a really fascinating thing. It's not that we change as people, but I think what becomes acceptable is different. And so people can press against that anxiety and get to a different place. So anyway, I just wonder what you think about those kids. Where will they end up?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about them. One of the drafts of the book actually went way further until like 1956, and it ended the same way, but the kids were much older. And so I had a chance to think about them, and I think they would do the same thing. I think it's a natural thing to want to sort of push beyond what feel like the confines of whatever structure you were raised within. And I think one thing that's interesting to me as a person who like is the daughter age, but is sort of on the cusp of like being a parent age, is that your kids won't necessarily understand how hard you fought to be in your position, or all of the things you had to overcome to be in a position that they then find repressive. And so that conflict, or that sort of contrast, I thought was really interesting too.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So if you decide to write again about these characters, it'll be fun to see what you do with the kids,
where they go.
Where do they go?
I do love the kids. Yeah.
I think it'll be, well, we'll get to what you're doing pretty soon. I want to stay on the book though. You talked a little bit about the era, and I really like this era. I think it's really, well, for example, just the cover, the book cover really depicts the time in which this story is taking place, the outfits the girls have on, and you just see their little, like their hair and their neck, you don't see their whole faces, but I felt like it's really, I just wanted you to talk a little bit for us about why you chose this time frame, and maybe you have touched on that a little bit, but you made the story very relevant to us today in spite of the fact that it's from this older era. And so maybe talk about how you navigate that.
Yeah, I chose the time frame because it's a very vibrant time in New York, and in Brooklyn in particular. It's sort of after this unbelievably massive wave of immigration that happened at the end of the 19th century and beginning of 20th century. Starts in between two world wars. So there's this sense of like, possibility. It's a really vibrant time in the mob, actually. There's a lot going on historically around that time that was just like so much of it, of course, obviously every time doesn't make it in, but I can sort of see the setting that these people lived in. And I really enjoyed being there. And then in Brooklyn in particular, Brooklyn's a little bit younger than Manhattan. So it wasn't quite as, the development of Brooklyn is newer. So it wasn't quite as built up as like downtown Manhattan would have been at that time period. And I wanted the reader to be able to see sort of Brooklyn evolving as the characters evolved. And I think Red Hook in particular and South Brooklyn in particular underwent a ton of change then. Those neighborhoods, Red Hook, Carroll Gardens, Cobble Hill, are still in part Italian, but there's a lot of shift that's happened over the last almost 100 years. So it just felt like a really sort of vibrant and exciting time to spend time in, setting to spend time in.
So while we're talking about the setting, and I did mention the book cover, can you tell us how the book cover gets selected? I always find that fascinating. Like how did they pick that? It was such a good cover.
Yeah, we had a different cover originally, and then they suggested this one, and it's really a striking image. And so I'm very grateful for that. I wouldn't have picked it myself, which is one of the things that's like cool and interesting about this process. You sell a book and it's like, the book that I sell is something that I spent 5 years by myself on my computer writing with basically no hope that anybody else would ever read it, but also feeling a great deal of sort of ownership over.
Sure.
And then it goes to this incredible team of people who all care about it, each of whom thinks it's their book. And it is, for each of them, it is their book in a way. It's my agent's book, it's my editor's book, it's the marketing and the publicity and the cover design people's, like, they did this book, they put themselves into it. And so the cover it's just one of those really cool ways that the book becomes a collaboration. At least in my case, I had very little to do with it. They came to me with a couple different little options, but ultimately, contractually, actually, ultimately it's their decision. And ultimately there are people whose job it is to do the cover.
Well, they certainly did a good job. And
it's really striking.
It is. I like it a lot. So when you talk about a book being, you've spent all this time writing it, and now it's out in the world, and it really isn't yours anymore. I mean, it is, but how it interacts with the rest of the world is now in the hands of the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
You've done what you can do, and now it's theirs. And so, how does that feel? I mean, it must be kind of, I don't know, must be kind of a funny feeling.
It's totally funny. It's really surprising. And I think anybody who's in sort of the trenches of writing something or working on something that doesn't have a guaranteed audience, like, it's hard to explain, but you can understand the way that it is surreal for it to all of a sudden have an audience and a life outside of you. One of the things that I was most surprised by is the process of disconnection. So when I sold this book, and even when I was editing it, it felt like my arm. It felt like a part of me. It felt like it was me in a way. And now it feels very separate from me. It's out in the world. It's doing its own thing. It's like, I don't know, like a child that's grown up, and it's out there living its own life. And that was actually kind of a pleasure in some ways. After spending so much time with it, it's like a relief to have it out there and not to feel every single like criticism that comes across my desk so personally. I can understand as a bookseller and as a human being and as a writer, like, of course you don't always connect with the book. And then I still get to interact with people that like did love it, which is incredible. And to have people reach out to me and tell me that like my book helped them process something in their own life, or that they connected deeply to something that I wrote, is really, really powerful. And I'm really, really grateful for that.
Yeah, it's got to be quite an experience. I would imagine, I've never written a book, but I did raise a couple of kids. And so, you let them go,
Yeah.
they're out there, and now, it's their life to live. And,
Yeah.
but also, just thinking about how different readers take in a story. I've been in book clubs for years, and it's always fascinating to me how the group will interpret things so differently.
Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine as an author reading different people's comments, it must be like, wow, I wonder how they got that out of it. And we'll just sort of argue with each other about, no, I don't think that's what it meant. And, it's kind of, it's fun to do that as a reader, but I think it might be harder as the author of that book.
I mean, to be honest, I don't do it very often, just because at this point, my goal is how can I sort of focus inward and ground myself and get started on a new project. And I can't do that if I'm getting a bunch of outside opinions, even if they're really good ones, which they are sometimes and not others. I'm really grateful for my experience as a bookseller, because every day I watch people disagree about books that, like, one of them, it changed their lives, and the other one didn't connect to it at all. And so I feel like I have this sort of more grounded perspective and understanding of just how a book moves through the world. And that's been really cool.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I've been a reader all my life, and I love reading, and some stories just capture you, and that's always such a special thing. So when you can provide that to someone, I think that's a pretty high accomplishment. So good for you. And
it's the best part of the whole thing, I think.
Yeah, I would think so too. So I still kind of want to talk about the book a little bit more. And then I want to get into you and your process. But and this is kind of an unfair question, I think.
Go
but
ahead.
do you have a favorite character, or was there someone that was more fun than anybody else, or that you connected with more?
So I actually like that question. Sometimes people ask me which character I most like, and there's not a good answer to that question because I sort of put myself into all of them in different ways. I will say, in terms of connection, no, because I spent so much time with each of them that I love them all. And I had to be able to get into each of their heads to the extent that I could understand how and why they were making each decision that they made. And so, I think that once you do that, you have to love somebody. Like, once you understand them that well, it's really hard not to feel connected to them. So in that way, I do feel really connected to all of them, or I at least couldn't pick out one that I feel more connected to than another. I will say that Saul's sections were really fun for me to write, which is a little bit strange because Saul, who we haven't talked about, is a Jewish refugee during World War II that ends up becoming sort of enmeshed with this other family. And a lot of his sections are pretty dark, but I saw him very clearly. And so then it was very satisfying for me to get him down on paper and to get his life down on paper, on computer. I didn't write a word of this on paper, but on computer. That felt really good from a writing perspective.
Cool. That's cool. So let's move a little bit to the ending. I don't want to give anything away, but it was very dramatic. You have, just for those of you who are out there listening, the book comes to this great climax at the end. A lot of things come together. And so what was your thinking there, and how did you plan that? And did you kind of just let the story get there, or, what's your process around that?
So I knew that I wanted the book to end very close to this climactic moment. I wanted to end sort of on a high, and I wanted not to have a whole bunch of denouement or a bunch of sort of describing what happens to each of them afterward. I wanted this big sort of climactic scene to feel like an ending. And I think that's one of the things that for some people it does. And for some people, they're like, this is a cliffhanger. So I totally get what I'm like striving to do there. I think the thing that I learned during edits is that in order to end on that very action-packed moment, each of the emotional arcs of each of the characters has to sort of come to a head right before that moment. So as the action plot unfolds, the character arcs have to also be reaching a resolution. And that is, if I pull it off, that's the way that I pull off ending on sort of a very abrupt kind of a high note. And that was a big part of my edit process, was getting those two things to sort of work together.
To mesh and come together. And, oh, the timing was great. I mean, it really did. It worked quite well. So so you went into this story knowing that's what you wanted in the end, but what is your process like when you're sitting down to write a book? Do you kind of have an outline worked out? I know different authors have different ways of going about this. And I always find it interesting to find out what's your process like? How much do you have the story determined before you sit down to write? Or
well, this is my first book. So in that way, I really felt like I was stumbling through it the whole time. Like I think I could have saved myself maybe years by outlining differently. But at the same time, in order for me to stay interested enough in the story, it had to surprise me a little bit. And so it's one of the things that I wonder now. I'm sort of in between projects, and I'm wondering, as I kind of gear up and start to spend time, with myself and with writing, and like start to exercise those muscles again. I'm wondering if writing a second book will feel different, if I'll feel more like I'm situated in the process, or if I'll still just feel like I'm kind of fumbling through the whole thing. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to do some more productive kind of outlining or planning or understanding of the greater arc of the story before I write, but not so much that I then lose interest. I don't think I'll ever be somebody that writes down every scene before I get into it, or knows how many chapters there are going to be, just because I think it just has to feel a little bit more alive. And for me, that process of outlining makes it not feel more alive. And I think each writer has to just kind of trick themselves into writing however they can.
Sure. And so do you have a schedule where I like to write in the morning, or I like to write, or I just go write when I feel the calling? How do you handle that?
I write in the morning. And when I was writing The Family, I had lots of other different part-time jobs. So I would usually, and I managed to do it so that I had a pretty flexible schedule. So I'd be able to get up really early and write for not that long, for like an hour or two, and then go do my other work. And that way it's just my freshest brain, the morning brain. So I feel, grateful for it and protective of it. And it really works better for me if I have the willpower to kind of like get myself out of bed and get myself to writing, rather than getting into the world first.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting to see how you plan your day. I mean, are there days where you just get up and there's nothing there, there's nothing to write? Or do you
every day lately?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. And so in that way, for me at least, and for a lot of the writers that I know, the routine is sort of the lifeline. Like you know that every day will feel different. You know that some days it won't be there, and you know that some days it'll feel really good for no reason. And I think what's key for me, and something that I'm hoping will cause me less angst the second time I do this, because I know I've done it once, is that days where it feels like nothing's happening are, I think, days when I'm doing the work on behalf of days when it feels really good. So trying not to think of any of it as wasted time, but definitely also being able to like ride the ebbs and flows of days that it like feels like writing, and days that it feels like staring into space.
There's a concept about looking out the window, and we call that, it's often referred to as the daydreamers or whatever, but there's a really important aspect of just having time to look out the window.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of paraphrase it that way in your spirit. It's I'm just looking out the window today, and that's where a lot of ideas come together. So
I love that. I'm going to keep that in mind tomorrow when I wake up and I have nothing to write.
Just looking out the window. Because I think it would be frustrating to get up and just, not have something come to mind, or feel like, oh, I spent an hour and I got 2 words down, but if your time was spent, as you say, that's where your work is being done, in that quiet time. It's kind of like when you're trying to solve a problem and you step away from it and then suddenly a solution will come.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
well, good. So you grew up in Berkeley, and I know
did.
you went to college in New York. So we can kind of call you an East Bay author,
Totally.
you know?
I still feel that way.
Is there anything about your upbringing in this area that you feel prepared you for writing, or that, I don't know, that you take with you when you're writing? I don't know, culturally?
I mean, yes, of course, is sort of the answer. Like, you know, I feel very formed by where I grew up. And let's see, one of the things that I do think is notable, or that feels true to me when I'm writing, is that the setting is very important to me. And I grew up in a pretty outdoorsy family. I spent a lot of time outside, not just in California, but my dad lived in Alaska for several years. And so I spent a lot of time like feeling, sort of trying to get more in touch with the parts of people that are animals, and being outside, and being not in my intellectual body. And I think that even when I'm writing about New York City, I'm writing about it like it's land, and I'm writing about people in New York as connected to the setting that they live in. And I don't know, it's possible that that would be true if I had grown up anywhere else. But I think and I think that moving to New York from California also helped me to really understand how formed I had been by the land, by the culture, by the people that I grew up within. And so then I was able to sort of figure out how these characters are formed by the culture and the place that they grow up within.
Yeah, it's very different, you know, and I think it's always a wonderful opportunity to live other places.
Yeah.
As much as home can be very comforting and can be hard to leave, I do think you learn things that you just can't if you don't relocate.
I agree.
So well, that's interesting. How long, I mean, when did you know you wanted to be a writer?
The first time I saw a book,
Really?
I went like, what is that? I want to make one. I think I was a reader before I was a writer. I learned to read, you know, my dad taught me when I was 4. I learned to read the Little Bear books. I went to school. I read all those books. I went to the library. I got a wagon. I got a stack like this of Babysitter's Club books and Nancy Drew books, and I brought them all home and I read them all. I just loved to read. I loved to be in another world. I would read while I was walking around. I would read while I was eating. And eventually that sort of naturally transitioned into a desire to write. But I think it all stems from the same place of just really loving to be immersed in another world, and really sort of feeling like I process the world a little bit through the empathy that I have for characters I don't know in books, in worlds that I don't live in books.
Sure.
It's a way of traveling, and it's a way of understanding myself and people around me. And it's just always been the thing that I love most. And I've always actually felt very grateful to have like a thing that I love most, because it's easy for me to focus in that way.
Yeah, and if you love to read, I don't think you ever really lose that.
Right.
At least in my life, that's been the experience. But I'm very grateful for you mentioning the library and what that meant to you as a young person, because you know that we're all about supporting our library here in Lafayette, and we all believe it's very important. And it's always reassuring to hear someone else talk about their experience and what that's meant. So here's another question. Your book was really a very early success. To get on the New York Times bestseller list, that's a big deal. And
it was a really big deal.
that's a big deal. And then to be selected by the Today Show, you know, Reads with Jenna book club. I mean, that's also that's a big deal, and that's very
Really big deal.
exciting. So how have you felt about all this newly assigned fame and recognition? Has that been fun? Has it been exciting?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the exposure that the Today Show book club gave my book is sort of it's not something that you can get anywhere else as a debut author right now. I think this is something I didn't really know before I started the book club process, and you might have a lot to do with it at the library too, or understand the process of it. But those book clubs are really powerful. Good Morning America and
Sure.
Jenna and Reese, and they're really, really powerful. And it was just such a gift to be given that kind of exposure. It meant that my book had sort of a fighting chance in a fall where so many books were being published by incredible authors. People were paying attention to mine because it had this huge, huge exposure. And ultimately, what that does is it gives me the freedom to write another book,
Sure.
which is like
Wow, how
the best
exciting.
thing that can happen. And it gives me access to an audience that has read the book and that has connected with the book and that can reach out to me about the book. And so that's really a gift. Doing publicity as a writer, I don't think it necessarily comes naturally to any of us. So like being on the Today Show for 5 minutes was fun, but I also was stressed out about it for 6 months beforehand.
Yes.
So it's like, it's a mixed bag, but ultimately it's something that I'm so grateful for.
Sure. Yeah, that had to be really exciting. And I'm sure your family and your friends were just like, oh my gosh, she's going to
Everyone's excited. Yeah, it was really nice.
Yes, that's really exciting. So any opportunity for this book to go to television or film?
We're working on it. So we're
Really?
still, film is a really slow process because you have to get like writers and producers and studios and all of these different people and institutions involved all on board together. So it's sort of a slow process, but I have really, really great agents that are working really hard. And I have talked to a couple of writers that I really love, and I really like adaptations. So I'm super excited to see what might happen with it,
Oh,
but
fingers
nothing's
crossed.
solid
Yeah.
yet.
Well, yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Thank you.
Let's see. I'm looking at the time here. We still have a couple of minutes. Jeff, are there many questions? I haven't been watching.
There
but-
are, but I wanted to throw one in personal,
Okay.
piggyback on your last one. The publicity tour, do you feel at all ripped off by the fact that it's happening in COVID? And, is there a higher level of fun that you might have had if this had happened in a less crazy time?
I feel mostly really lucky because of when my book was published during COVID, because I knew before my book came out, an entire year and a half almost of authors who got nothing. And I got to go on the Today Show in person, and I got to have a launch with my friends and family in New York. And I got to have a party at the bookstore I work at here. And I get to do this sort of blend of Zoom events and in-person events. So mostly because I'm embedded in this community of other authors whose books are coming out right now, I feel really lucky because in November, there was this window, cases weren't very high.
That's true.
I could do stuff in person, and it really felt like a celebratory time versus I know like one of my great friends had a book come out in March of 2020 and the end of her tour just got canceled. And I think authors whose books came out in that fall, that spring, that summer, really, really had a hard time.
I like that. Half full kind of gal. We have a question. Sounds like a fun book to read. Is there a bookstore that has autographed copies?
Yes. So the bookstore where I, until very recently, worked as a bookseller, I can put it in the chat even actually. It's called Blackbird Bookstore. It's in San Francisco. If you don't want to come out to the outer Sunset, which you could because it's beautiful out here, you're welcome to do that. If you don't want to come out here, you can order one online. And I will write in the chat, Blackbird Bookstore, which is in the outer Sunset neighborhood of San Francisco.
Cool.
I know Arinda Books is also selling your book. So
Yes. And they don't have signed copies, but I could go over there and sign them actually. That would be like,
or maybe the
a smart
easiest thing
idea
would
for me.
send them plates.
yeah, book plates that they could put in there.
yes,
That might be a good thing to do.
I
'cause
have
it
a
is.
bunch of those. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's coordinate that. So whoever that was
I'll hook you up
asking,
with Pat, the owner there.
yeah,
Yeah.
that would be good.
They've been very good about helping us promote our authors, and they obviously benefit from the sales too.
Well, I'm so grateful to them for stocking this for this purpose. And I feel like I should have thought of the book plates already, but that's just the debut author thing for you. I don't
That's
always
all
get
right.
there.
Okay. It'll be even that much greater that you do provide it, since you had to think about it. Let's see. Any other questions over there, Jeff?
Yeah, is there, how much of the editing process is you self-editing, and how much is your editor's editing? And just talk about that process a little bit.
So I wrote this book over the course of ultimately like 6 or 7 years. I wrote one full draft by myself. It took 2 years-ish. Then I spent 6 months or a year editing. I worked with, then I found an agent, which was a long process. And I lucked out and found an agent who's very hands-on and has a lot of sort of editorial ideas and really wanted to work with me. So we edited together. I did edits with her for 6 months or something. And then once I sold the book to the editor at Penguin, then I edited it again with her for a couple years. And usually the way that it's worked in my experience is the person editing, so my editor or my agent, will give me sort of big scale suggestions. This isn't working. This character arc's not working. This is confusing. We need more of this person. I don't understand what this character wants here. And then I'll go edit by myself. And then we'll sort of go back and forth and back and forth. And there's a little bit of like line editing where they'll go like, you know, this paragraph isn't working. This feels repetitive. But that comes way at the end, and it feels sort of like icing on top of all that big conceptual work.
Okay. I was curious about that.
Yeah.
And how does the process of promoting a book, you know, weave in with trying to get your next project going?
I think for some people it weaves really well. For me, it's been really hard to concentrate on my own work and on sort of the really fragile beginning stages of a project while I'm also promoting a book. So that's something that, like, as my events have slowed down this spring, I've had some more time to sort of ground myself and think about the next project. But I have to personally, I've found that I have to take a step sort of away from publicity in order to do that. But I also want to give the family the best chance it has. So I'm trying to balance those two things.
Yeah, I would imagine, especially being your first one.
Yeah.
That's right.
And you and Ruthie talked about, you know, where things are set and where you lived and experience. How, and I've heard variable things on this because some writers don't feel that you have to have lived someplace. What's your thought on that? And as you think about potential new subjects in books, of will you need to know that place, and how much, if you haven't lived there, will you visit, or is that even a fair question?
Yeah, it's a totally fair question. I think, I mean, it ties into this bigger question of whether you should be writing what you know, whether you should be writing
Right.
something that reflects your own lived experience. And I think yes and no. I think that one of the things that I love most about reading and writing is getting to experience things outside of my own lived experience. But at the same time, you need to have enough sort of cultural context and setting context and time period context to pull that off. And so I would love to spend time wherever it is that I set the next book. I think that setting's really powerful, and I think it's hard to write about a place without having been there, but there are examples of it working. So yeah, we'll see.
Guess it
Yeah, and if you're a
depends on
if you're a notable author, you get criticized if you do it that way sometimes.
If you're a notable author, you get criticized for almost everything and then praised for the same stuff. So I think ultimately you really have to be able to like hone in on what feels good to you and what you love and why you're doing what you're doing. But I hear you. Yes, there's a lot of criticism on both sides out there.
On that point, do you read your reviews? You must, because it's your first. No, you don't, really?
I read so I got some trade reviews, like, Kirkus and Publishers Weekly, they review it. I read those because my marketing team sent them to me. I read a couple of reviews that I got in big newspapers. I went on Goodreads and Amazon like a couple times, and then I thought, like, even the good reviews don't usually make me feel better about the book, or make me feel more creative, or make me feel more alive, or make me feel more connected to the people that are reading the book. So it's something I let go of pretty early on, just because it's not a good tool for me. Talking to people is a great tool for me. Engaging with other writing in the world and thinking about what I want to make next is a good tool for me. But like over analyzing Goodreads reviews is just not productive for me.
Good for
Yeah.
you. I would
Some people
say
like to just hear themselves talk.
Yeah, definitely. And then I also think even the good ones, even the reviews that are very sort of congratulatory, they just don't have the effect of making me feel better about the book. And so what that says to me is just like, these reviews are not a productive place for me to spend my time. Not even because everybody on there is like so cruel, because they're not. A lot of them are really kind and really thoughtful.
How about a writers group? Or do you compare? Have you been able to get involved with that?
I have several really good friends who are writers who I'm able to sort of bounce ideas off of, and whose work I'm lucky to read before other people. I'm not in a sort of regularly meeting writers group right now, and it's something I would like to do, but it's something that's hard, like during publicity, because I'm not writing anything.
Yeah.
So that's definitely on my list of goals.
Someday you'll be writing blurbs.
I've written a blurb or two already.
Oh, good.
Nice. Very good. That's fun. Get to read a book. So speaking of all of that, are there any favorite books of yours that you'd like to leave us with, or, books that you either are currently reading or that you consider, oh my gosh, this book is one of my faves?
Let's see. There's a book, I'm trying to work through books that I know are coming out around now, because I so appreciated when people did this for me. There's a book that's doing pretty well, actually. It's called How High We Go in the Dark. It came out in January, and I loved reading it. There's a book called Notes on an Execution. It's by a woman named Danya Kafka, and it's about a serial killer on death row, but it's sort of, my book is about a mafia family who you come to love. And so I'm really excited to read it for that reason, just because I feel like getting to love these otherwise unlovable characters is just one of the magics of fiction.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, this is a broader scale recommendation, but I read Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison for the first time this winter.
Great book.
And it is so, so beautiful. And so I just will never miss a chance to say, if she is not someone you've read and loved, you have a lot of beautiful reading ahead of you.
I agree. Amen to that. What was the title of the second book? I was making a note here.
It's called Notes on an Execution.
Notes on an Execution. Okay.
And the first one, how high can you?
How we go in the dark. Yeah.
How High We Go in the Dark.
Cool. Well, we're always looking for good books and new ideas for our program too.
I'm so glad.
We'll put those on our list of things to do. Well, Naomi, this has been delightful.
Thank you
you're
so much for having me.
And loved your book. And so, good luck with what you're doing next.
Thank you.
I know we'll get a chance to see you in person someday, which would be really, really fun at our lovely library.
I hope so. I would love that.
And
thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
You bet. And like I said, good luck in what you're doing, and just look out the window,
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to do it tomorrow morning.
All right. Best to you. Thank you.
Bye, you too.
So much.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
All right, Jeff.
I'm going to answer this last question.
Okay.
How high we go in the dark in chat. And what was the other one?
Notes on an Execution.
Okay.
And then, Song of Solomon.
All right. And Kelly, who submitted this, thank you. And you can also go to the very end on the YouTube and get it again also, or anyone else. Otherwise, we're going to sign off now, and thank you all for joining us.
Good night.
Thanks, Ruthie.
You're welcome.